Radha Ramana Hari Govind Jai Jai.
So yesterday we were talking about the spiritual world, material world and spiritual world. And today I want to talk about Jiva Tattva, the living entity. So at the moment we're in the material world. Now the goal is to go to the spiritual world. And I want to discuss the position of Jiva Tattva. Jiv means alive, like in Russian, Jivoy means it's alive. So it's the source of life. It's the Atma. In Sanskrit, Atma can mean body, mind, self, all sorts of different things. But Jiv, this means the spirit soul. Spirit soul, what is the spirit soul? The spirit soul right now is conscious, like you're hearing what I'm saying. So the spirit soul is conscious, it is actually perceiving. The spirit soul is acting through the body to act. And it's also operating the mind. So it's active, the soul is active. And how does it do that? Its qualities are like Krishna's Satchidananda Vigraha. Ishvara Param Krishna, Satchidananda Vigraha means eternity, knowledge and bliss. And the living entities, Mamaivangsa Jiva Loke. The living entities are Angsha, the little tiny parts and parcels of Krishna. So we're also Satchidananda. We also have eternal identity and knowledge and bliss, but in very minute proportion. So this is what Jiva is. Now, what is the position of the Jiva? Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur in Jaiva Dharma, he describes in the 5th shloka of Dashamula, he says, just as many tiny sparks burst out from a blazing fire, so the innumerable jivas are like atomic spiritual particles in the rays of the spiritual sun, Sri Hari. Though these jivas are none different from Sri Hari, they're also eternally different from him. The eternal difference between the Jiva and the Ishvara is that Ishvara is the Lord and Master of Maya Shakti, whereas the Jiva can fall under the control of Maya even in his liberated stage due to his constitutional nature. Thakur Bhaktivinoda gives some from the Vedas, from the Upanishads, gives examples to prove this. So many people think that the Upanishads only describe an impersonal truth. They describe that the real nature, they think that the real nature of the living entity is that it's one with Brahman. And only in illusion do we think that we're separate living entities, that the world really exists, that we're separate from the world. But actually, everything is Brahman. Jagamitya, Brahmasatya, Jagamitya. They think that this is the ultimate conclusion of the Upanishads. This is a completely false conclusion. It's because of the propaganda of the Mayavadis who are following false doctrine. So, but actually, Thakur Bhaktivinoda, he gives many quotations from the Upanishads which show conclusively that the jivas are actually tiny parts of Krishna, just like in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Innumerable jivas emanate from Parabrahman, just like tiny sparks from a fire. So it's not just illusion. Then, concerning the position of the jiva, it says there are two positions about which the Jiva Purush should inquire. There's the material world and the spiritual world. The Jiva is situated in the third position. So the spiritual, there's material, and then the third position, which is like, it's a dreamlike condition. And it's the Tatashta, it's the junction between these two, between the material and between the spiritual. So being situated, in the Upanishads it says, being situated where those two worlds meet, he sees both the inert world, Jad Jagat, and also the spiritual world, Chit Jagat. This is described in the Upanishads. And then Brihadaranyaka Upanishad again. It says that just like a large fish in a river sometimes goes to the eastern bank and sometimes goes to the western bank, so the Jiv, being in the Karna Jala, means in the water of the causal ocean, between the material world and the spiritual world, it goes to both banks. Either the material world, where he's in the place of dreaming, or he goes to the spiritual world, where he's in the place of wakefulness. So this is describing the position of the jiva. And in Takabhaktivinoda, in Jaiva Dharma, so Brajanath says, what is this tatashta? What is this region, the marginal situation between the spiritual and the material worlds? What is that? And Babaji Maharaj explains that the space between the ocean and the land, this is like the marginal position. But he says, actually, what is that place? Because either there's water or there's land. So there's a very, very, very fine line, which is more or less imaginary. It's very subtle. So the jiva is on a very, very, very fine, subtle line between the material world and the spiritual world. And from that position, the jiva can either see to the material world or the spiritual world. And those who are against service to Krishna, then they'll be attracted by the material energy and they'll go to the material world. And others will look to the spiritual energy and they'll go to the spiritual world. This is very briefly, that's the description of the Tatashta region, the marginal region. That's where we've come from. Many devotees think that somehow that we've fallen from the spiritual world. This is a myth, actually. It's not in accordance with the scripture. Nowhere in the scriptures is it said that we fall from Krishna's pastimes. It is described where we fall from. We've come from the glance of Mahavishnu. So how do we get from Krishna's pastimes into the glance of Mahavishnu? That they don't say. So the fact is that in Chaitanya Charitamrita it's described, in Srimad Bhagavatam it's described, and in Brahma Samhita it's described also, that Mahavishnu, he glances at the material energy, and within that glance there's the living entities, and in that way the living entities are impregnated into the material energy. So there's no question about falling from the pastimes. Jiva is not, although we're here in the material world, the jiva is not material in any way. It's not in any way material. So the question comes, well, how can we be mixed up? How can we mixed up in the mind, mixed up in the body? How come that we think that we're this material world? We're in illusion. We've become impure. What's happened is that the living entity, the jiva, comes into the material world, and the material energy gives, first of all, a subtle body. That subtle body consists of false ego, means I am the doer. I'm not the doer, actually. But this false ego tells us that I'm the doer, and then there's intelligence and mind. This is the subtle body. And then there's a gross body, composed of water, earth, water, fire, air, ether, sky, inert elements. So these are the two bodies that cover the living entity. And under the influence of the material energy, the living entity identifies with the mind. It's like somebody playing a video game, Dungeons and Dragons. He's glued to the screen. He's getting his weapons, he's fighting with the dragons, or whatever. Totally glued. So somebody comes, oh, it's lunchtime. No time. Totally glued. And he's thinking, I am a warrior. I am such and such a warrior. He's completely identified. Can't give it up. So the conditioned soul is like that. Actually, there's no reality there. There's no reality in that game. If you switch off the computer, the game's finished. Similarly, our relationship, although this material world is real, but our relationship with the world is not real. But under the influence of material energy, with thinking, we identify that this is my body, this is my mind, this is me, this is my situation. So many people think that the world is illusion. The world is not illusion, but our connection with the world is illusion. I'm thinking this is my body, or this is me. Not even my body, this is me. Or my body, my situation, my husband, my wife, my possessions. But they're going to be finished at some point. If it's mine, it can't be taken away. Everything in this material world can be taken away, and it will be taken away. So nothing's right. That's the illusion. There's the Mayavadis. They think that the living entity is not actually real. They think that everything is Brahman. Brahman is everything. The one the oneness. But under illusion, Brahman has been covered by illusion and thinks that I'm Jiva. So I'm thinking I'm Jiva. You're also thinking you're an individual self. But when we become enlightened, when we become free from illusion, then we'll get free from this idea that we're separate. So there's this idea, I'm God, you're God. This, first of all, it's not anywhere stated in the Vedic scriptures. It's like this is a false theory that's being put forward. In Bhagavad Gita, Krishna, Mamaivang Sajiva Loke, Jiva Bhuta Sanatanaha. They're my tiny parts and parcels, and they're eternal. If they're eternal, it means that they've always existed as tiny parts and parcels of the Supreme Lord. Not that at some point they've separated off under illusion or thinking that they're illusion, and then again they'll merge into the oneness. This is the first thing, that it's against scripture conclusions. Second thing is, it doesn't make any sense. Because if everything's one Brahman, what does Brahman mean? Brahman means great. So how did Brahman get covered with illusion? And where did that illusion come from? If everything's one and there's just Brahman, so what's the illusion? If the illusion is Brahman, then how can it cover Brahman? If it's not Brahman, if it's something else, then there's not only oneness, there's duality there. There's so many arguments against this. This is not a logical argument at all. It's not a logical philosophy. The Vaishnava philosophy, it actually makes sense. It makes sense in terms of the way that we experience the world. But this philosophy, this Mayavada philosophy, it doesn't actually make sense at all. Babaji Maharaj explains that what is the nature of the Jeev. So he says that, he explains the nature of the Jeev, and he says that you'll have to realize this by chanting, and chanting in contact with the eternal spiritual reality, so you'll realize these things. But to try to understand it, where the jivas come from, theoretically, we won't be able to understand. As long as we don't have this, like aprakrit, as long as we don't have this realization, actual realization, I'm not this body, I'm spiritual, spirit, soul, then we can't really understand these things theoretically. Example is given that, just like in the Upanishads, it said that the jivs are like sparks from a fire, or they're like the little molecules of sunshine in the ray, in emanating from the sun. So in Jaiva Dharma, Thakur Bhaktivinoda explains this further. Thakur Bhaktivinoda explains that Krishna is like the sun, and the jivs are like atomic molecules of sunshine. But he also explains that Krishna is like a fire, and the jivs, they're like tiny little sparks from the fire. So the sunshine and the sun, in one sense, they're not different from each other. But at the same time, they are different. So now he explains that in some more detail. That the jivs, they're not separate from Krishna, even though they've come from him. He gives the example that an egg, for example, is produced from the body of the mother bird. And when it's produced, then it becomes separate from the mother. There's the egg and there's the mother. The fingernails, they're also produced from the body. But they remain, even though they're produced by the body, or the hair, either come to that. Although it's produced by the body, it doesn't become separate from the body. So similarly, in a similar way, Krishna, we can say, produces the jivs, although in fact the jivs are eternal. But they're parts and parcels of Krishna, but at the same time they're not different from him. Another example, that if somebody makes a gold bangle from a piece of gold, so from the point of view of the gold bangle is still gold. It isn't. It's still gold by nature. The quality is still gold. But from the point of view of the bangle, it's become separate from the gold. So, from the point of view of Krishna, the living entities are still his parts and parcels. But from the point of view of the conditioned living entities, we're seeing ourselves as separate from Krishna. So, there's differences and there's similarities between the Jiva and Krishna, Ishvara. The similarities are that they're both spiritual. They're both... Krishna, he's the embodiment of knowledge. He knows. He's the knower also. He's thinking, and he's the enjoyer. So he has his own desires, and he knows everything. And the Jiva also has these qualities. He's a form of knowledge. He's also the knower. He also is the enjoyer. He also has his desires. So in very minute part, he has similar qualities to Krishna. But there's one very important difference. And that is that Krishna is controlling the material energy. The material energy is Krishna's energy, and Krishna's controlling that material energy. At no time can he come under the control of the material energy. That's not possible. Whereas the tiny atomic Jiva is like a little part of Krishna, and that he's controlled by the material energy. This is the main difference. So there's always difference and non-difference. Then Thakur Bhaktivinoda, he explains that although both are there, there's non-difference and there's also difference, but the difference is always prominent. Difference is always prominent. So then the living entity comes into the material world. He gets first of all the subtle body, and then he gets the gross body. Then in this material world, the living entity identifies with the body, and when the body dies, then he gets another body. How does he get the other body? It's described that this is like a tree. So a tree produces fruits. The fruits are produced by the tree, and then the fruit or the seed, that produces the next tree. So similarly, the living entity in his lifetime, it produces fruit. What's that? It's karma. And then at the time of death, his mentality will be determined by what kind of activities he performed during that lifetime. So then, those activities, that karma, that determines the mentality he has at a time of death, and that will determine what kind of body he gets. So Krishna says, Yang yambapi smaram bhavam chenchitante kalevaram. Whatever you're thinking of at the time of death, whatever your mentality is at the time of death, that determines your body, next body. So this is a process of transmigration. So he's got the gross body he gives up. Like, for example, if somebody has a motor car and the motor car is not working, becomes old, so he gets out of that motor car and he gets into another motor car. And the kind of motor car that he gets depends on two things. It depends on what he wants and how much money he's got. So similarly, when the body becomes unworkable, when it dies, so the next kind of body we get depends on our desires and also our karma. Those two things. So in this way, the living entity is transmigrating through 8,400,000 species of life. The species themselves are eternal. Sometimes they're present, sometimes they're not. Just like we don't see dinosaurs on the earth at the moment, but they can be somewhere else. So the species are eternal, but the living entity is simply going from one species to another, one species to another, one species to another. When it comes to the human form of life, then we have the choice, and we can either go up, for example, to the heavenly planets, or we can go down. Or we can become completely free. By taking up devotional service, we can become completely free from all material entanglements, and we can become more and more absorbed in devotional service. And when we're completely free from material attachments, and when we have full mercy of Krishna, then we'll go to the spiritual world by the grace of Gurudev. So this is our goal. Our goal is to become completely absorbed in devotional service, loving service to Krishna, and then all the arrangements will be made where we go after that. Hare Krishna.